drugs affect your spirit from a former addict. Now, before I became very spiritual, before I started to go beyond these dependencies, I was addicted to Oxycontin, cocaine for a time, and very much alcohol. If I would have gone into rehab without narrowing down the amount of alcohol that I ingested, then I would have had to go to the hospital because I wouldn't be able to go straight into rehab. That's how addicted to alcohol that I was. And Oxycontin, I was taking quite a bit of it a day, every day. Now, cocaine I didn't use as much of, but I used quite a bit of that. And what I realized about dependency is that you can feel your brain not producing the dopamine necessary or usual in your life when it comes to eating, when it comes to being around friends, when it comes to exchanging with your loved ones. Usually dopamine will produce a good amount of what it needs to in order for you to accept that subconsciously as a reward. This is how the brain naturally behaves. So when you're taking in false dopamine, or your brain is tricked into releasing more dopamine than it should at times when it shouldn't, then that's when your brain decreases the amount of dopamine that it produces. It decreases the receptors of dopamine in itself, so that the things that were enjoyable in your regular life, in your everyday life, are no longer enjoyable. They are basically secondary to the main dopamine inducer. That is the drug you're addicted to. This can be true for alcohol to a certain extent, but it's a little bit different with alcohol. But drugs, this is very true. Cocaine, Oxycontin, heroin, methamphetamine especially. I tried that for a little while, and it was terrible because you had this 3-day hangover, and it wasn't worth the high. The high was not worth it, and it gets you addicted really quick, including Oxycontin and cocaine, don't get me wrong. But regardless, going beyond that, what I found is that, especially when I used meth, my connection to my life force was severed. My ego could not connect with my life force, my natural energy, in the same way. It just felt like, though there was a large amount of dopamine being flooded into my system, it felt like that's the only thing I felt. I no longer felt my spirit. It took me a long time to understand what I was feeling, but I no longer felt my prana. I call life force, I call prana spirit. This is my understanding of it anyway. You might have your own. But I felt cut off with large amounts of drugs releasing dopamine. I felt cut off from my deeper nature. The deeper nature and the ascension of your spirit are one. They collaborate in your expansion of consciousness that is necessary to reach higher and higher realms, higher and higher understandings, even in this world. And your relation to other people, understanding them as a part of yourself, it cuts you off from your natural energetic ability to connect with other people through your life force. Now, when you're talking to a loved one, when you're talking to a friend, when you're having an exchange, there is an exchange of life force as well. You're basically encouraging each other's prana, encouraging each other's energy when it's a positive conversation. And when it is negative, you're feeding on each other. But when it is positive, and you're having this exchange, when you're addicted to a drug, the exchange of life energy, just because of proximity and your relation to that person, is cut. It severs that. So normal human exchanges that should produce, or at least encourage, the energy, our life force, spirit, no longer does that. That is what is terrifying about drug addiction. It makes us into a being that is no longer a healthy human. It makes us into a being that is very attached to material. A being that cannot feel happy without material ingestion. And I'm not just talking about food, which can be a healthy relationship. I'm talking about the unnatural increase of dopamine in the system, and your brain will respond. The brain is a miraculous thing. Its evolution has allowed it to adapt to certain situations. And if it feels like you are getting dopamine from an external source, that it doesn't need to produce as much dopamine, it won't. And this is a terrible and scary phase of existence to be in if you've ever been addicted to a drug or are addicted to drugs. coming from a former addict, and I am a former addict, in AA and NA, they say you're always an addict, even after you stop using, so you have to be careful. And that's true to a certain extent, but I consider myself a former addict. Coming from a former addict, I guarantee that no matter how many drugs you use, no matter how much dopamine floods your system, it does not produce the altered state of consciousness that is desirable in a spiritual life. Now, with marijuana, it's not the same addiction, but a lot of people, it's part of their spiritual practice to smoke marijuana. And it does produce an altered state, but it also produces a dependency, a spiritual dependency, if you consider it spiritual, on an altered state being induced through consumption of marijuana. That doesn't mean that it's the worst drug. I don't even really have a problem with marijuana, but we shouldn't basically stake our spiritual progress on external material that cannot be induced within, because it can be induced within. You don't need the drugs. You don't need even weed. You can induce states through concentration, through meditation, through focus on what it is that your spiritual goal is. And it should be moksha, liberation, or union with everything, and a realization that we do not start and begin at the edge of our flesh, but everything is merged into one grander consciousness. Now, living the life of an addict requires you to get money, because you need to afford these things. And you start to become more focused on getting money, more focused on getting more and more of the drug. You start to get focused on just receiving that high and not really producing anything with your life. And it's a real shame, because a human life wasted is the greatest loss of opportunity that anything on this planet can experience. Because human life is blessed with human consciousness, a human consciousness that is bestowed upon us through many millennia, not even millennia, but millions of years of evolution, towards sentience, towards being able to hold a sentient soul who has reached a level of not only understanding, but the ability to self-evaluate in a way that no other animal on this planet can, or plant, of course. There's an experience of consciousness that is halted by the use of drugs, that is cut off by the use of drugs. And it is a waste of who we are, our soul's mission, to use drugs and be dependent on that material. That doesn't mean just because you use drugs once or twice, or even if you were addicted for many years before or addicted now, that doesn't mean you can't come back from the brink of that spiritual isolation. You can come back. You can greet the day once more, not as somebody who is dependent on material, but as somebody who has accepted their true nature is to evolve and connect past any material obsession, any material dependency. And when we are greedy people, when we get a certain amount of money, we start to feel prideful. That releases some dopamine, and we get addicted to making money more and more and more. So this is another addiction to material. Drugs isn't the only addiction to material. When we become dependent on social media as well, ironically, social media like this, you receive a certain amount of likes, you start to have a little bit of a tinge in the brain where a little bit of dopamine is released, a little bit sputters out with the amount of likes that you get on, let's say, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, retweets, or your Instagram pictures, how many times they're viewed. We get these little spurts of dopamine, and those little spurts are okay as long as we aren't dependent upon satisfying those around us through material means. If we provide a service of connection, a service of understanding, and that's what we share with the world through social media, then that's when these little spurts of dopamine can be encouraging towards us helping other people. Or let's say that we operate in a charity without social media. We actually work towards helping our family or helping our community. And we receive these little spurts of dopamine when we do it, and we feel good. Or if you're a doctor that heals children, or tries to correct people's bones, or perform surgery, and you feel good when you've helped that person get better, when you've helped that person achieve a healthier life, or even a longer life. That's the kind of reward system that should be encouraged in the brain. And that reward system is cut off when you start to only associate reward with drugs, and it's psychosomatic and it's chemical. So your brain responds to that chemical ideology, I guess you could say, in the psyche. It says, okay, well, I don't need to produce as much dopamine from these natural, causes of dopamine, whether it's helping somebody or getting close to somebody you love. I need to decrease the amount of receptors, and I need to decrease the amount that I produce, so that, because there is no need for it. That's what the brain is subconsciously doing through its through its neurons. And I say subconscious because that's the part of the brain that is more habitual and behavioral than actually a relation to what we choose ideologically. But the brain will respond and not produce the amount of dopamine you would get from a healthy life if you live a life attached to material gain specifically. So think carefully before you continue a life addicted, before you continue a life of material attachment. Because as a former addict, I can say that it will lead you down a road of obsession, and your life will not be the fullest that it could be. And human life is very valuable. The most valuable thing on this planet. All the wealth in the universe cannot buy back a single moment in your life. So be careful with it. Hold your life, grasp it. It is not just yours, it is everyone's. And understand that you share yourself with the world, not through a dependency on material or an encouragement within on that which just produces a high. What you can give the world is who you truly are, your very being, your soul's mission. Find that mission. Go away and tread lightly away from a path addicted to material. Because oftentimes, if we try to just tear ourselves away from the path that we were on, we end up falling back in. But slowly start to make little changes. Make little changes in your behavior. Slowly edge yourself away from a life obsessed and towards a life expanded. Thank you very much for watching. This has been a video about how drugs affect your spirit from a former addict. And I would like to say, do not think that your spirit isn't something you can choose to increase or decrease. Know that you, as a person, your ego, can have an exchange with your spirit that tears apart the walls between you and your spirit. And most definitely between your spirit and other spirits. Spirit being life force. And somewhere in there, we will find soul consciousness. You can call it Christ consciousness, you can call it Krishna consciousness. But somewhere deep within, with the proper use of spirit, we will pierce into the soul's true experience. And that is samadhi. That is expansion, that is union with all. Thank you very much for watching. I hope all of you find yourselves.